You want to learn after you reflect to release the emotion and replace it with another emotion. That's pratipaksha bhavana also. So let's say that you're really bound up in anger. How can you get beyond anger and replace it with another emotion? One great emotion to replace anger with is love. When you really love somebody, when your heart is melting with love, you tend not to feel angry feelings. You tend to be very forgiving. Anger tends to come from the head, and love comes from the heart. So you want to switch your area of being from head-oriented to heart-oriented. I'll tell you an interesting story about a friend of mine. She was a psychiatric social worker and was working with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, founding one of the very early palliative care units, and she was dealing with people dying of cancer. And she absolutely loved her work and found great satisfaction in helping people to make this very important transition in life. Then one day she discovered a lump in her own breast and thought, this can't be. This can't be happening. No, it's not really cancer. I can't be getting cancer. She had seen so many people die, of course, of cancer. And the lump was diagnosed as being cancerous. And she got very, very angry at life, angry at God, because she was now going to suffer what she had seen so many people suffer. But more than that, she was angry because she could not continue her work. She was cut down in the prime of her life from this wonderful work of being involved with other people. So she tried for quite a while to keep it a secret. And little by little, it became known to her colleagues that she had cancer, and they started to sort of try to protect her when they would be sitting in meetings from hearing about the difficulties of people who were dying on their ward, because they felt that she might also be affected emotionally by hearing about this. So that made her angry, because now even her colleagues were starting to cut her out of the work while she was still had plenty of energy, wanted to be using this energy for the good of all. So one day she was called to visit a young woman who was very afraid of dying. This young woman, Melanie, was a young professional, married woman, had never been sick a day in her life, and was diagnosed suddenly with advanced lung cancer. And she was full of anger, and really afraid and angry about dying. So they asked my friend Jeannie to go and visit her. When she went into her room, there was this very nicely dressed young woman sitting up in bed talking to a young medical student. And she smiled at Jeannie and introduced Jeannie to the med student by name. And she said, "This is Jeannie. She used to work here as a social worker, but now she's dying just like me." And Jeannie was completely taken aback, because she had come in as a professional social worker here to do her job, with that safe distance where she could assess the person's needs and use all her professional skills to help this person. And all of a sudden, she's not wanted for her professional skills. This young woman is happy to see her because she's just like me. She's dying too. And Jeannie said it was very, very difficult to make that transition, very difficult to let go of the professional distance. And she said Jeannie herself had lots of people with whom to share her inner feelings about death, and it was very painful to have to share her own feelings about death with this other person, because it made her so vulnerable, made her so terribly, terribly vulnerable, and she had to open up so deeply, and all of the professional reserve was gone. And this young woman would say to her, "How do you cope when you get up in the morning? Do you believe it's you? Aren't you angry? And Jeannie, aren't you afraid of dying?" And Jeannie would say, "Well, I've seen so many people die beautiful deaths, surrounded by people they love." And Jeannie had had several heart attacks when she was younger and had been very close to death. So she shared that, in fact, sometimes you're working so hard just to breathe that letting go of breath seems easier than holding on, and that perhaps death would be like that for both of them. Just you're too tired to breathe anymore, and you peacefully let go of the breath. And little by little, Jeannie helped this young woman to overcome her fears and realize that with all the rest of her family, this young woman, who had always been the strong one in her family, had to put up a front. She had to be brave, she had to be courageous, she had to keep them together because they were so upset. And only with Jeannie was she able to let go, express her fears, get her fears relieved, and be totally herself. And as her disease progressed, the young woman's disease progressed, she used to hang a sign on the door of her room some days saying, "No visitors, please, except Jeannie." And Jeannie was a little puzzled by this because she knew that this vivacious young woman had become very friendly with all of the caregivers on that ward. And one day the young woman explained it to her. She said, "I'm afraid of becoming too close to them because I know I'm going to lose them all. I'm going to die, and I have to say goodbye to all of them. But you're coming with me. We're going on a trip together, and it's like we're planning it together." And suddenly Jeannie saw her problem, her cancer, as a great gift. Because no longer was she the professional social worker with the polite reserve, with the bag of tricks to help people get through their experience. Now she was one of them, a privileged listener, a privileged partner, someone who could share the journey that they didn't feel they had to say goodbye to. That was 17 years ago. Jeannie has been listed as terminal with cancer for 17 years. She's alive today, and I call her when I have problems. Yeah. I'm never, ever, ever depressed. Never depressed when I speak to her. And this remarkable woman, as the disease progresses, you of course lose everything. She has metastasis everywhere. She is not in remission. She has brain cancer, lung cancer, bone marrow cancer. Her hands are pathologically broken. That is to say, they break faster than they heal, so they're blew up to here. I mean, you just would not believe the strength of soul of this woman. And sometimes I've asked her, "Jeannie, how can you spend all your time listening to these people with their problems?" Because, that's another difficulty we have with problems, is how do we feel about other people's problems who we love very deeply? How can she cope with people who really are dying day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out? She said, "Well, on the gross level, on the exterior level, there's not much I can do. There's not really very much I can do. They have terrible, terrible problems. For example, I knew a young mother who had 2 teenage daughters. This woman had been abandoned by her husband, raised her daughters alone, and these 2 teenage daughters really had nothing. They were going to die. Their mother was going to die, and they really had almost no financial reserves. She was very, very concerned about them and worried about them. And this was her one preoccupation about dying. And Jeannie could see that this worry might possibly, go with her. And when the lady became very near to death, Jeannie went to visit her, and her daughters came to see her with a whole bunch of their friends. They walked onto the ward like 10, 15 teenagers carrying guitars. And the nurses thought, "My God, she's going to die any minute. Let's get these kids out of here." And Jeannie said, "No, let them stay." And they came in and they all sat around. They took out the guitars and they started singing songs. They sang show tunes. They sang beautiful rock ballads. They sang folk tunes. And as they sat and sang to this woman, this beautiful feeling of peace and joy spread over her face. You could see that she saw that who her daughters was, who they had become because of her, was so beautiful that they were surrounded by love, that they were surrounded by support, and that she was not leaving them alone. And she died. Peacefully, beautifully. Now Jeannie's gift was just to be there and say, let them alone. Don't send them out of here. Sometimes that's all that's needed. And other times all that's needed is just to listen. And sometimes you hear something that the other person isn't hearing. So in the case of this young woman, Melanie, that I mentioned who said, "Oh, you're going with me?" One of her resistances that her family interpreted as the fear of death was that she didn't want to make a will. And they thought she didn't want to make a will because she was afraid of dying. But when Jeannie talked to her, it became very clear very fast that she didn't want to make a will because her husband was very weak and drank and had let her down so many times in life. And common sense was saying to her, he shouldn't have the money, he'll squander it. And the money should go to somebody else in my family who could really make good use of it. And the leftover fear and resentment and anger that he had let her down so many times was making her feel like she shouldn't give him the money either. And Jeannie just listened, and then she said, what would you really like to do? How would you really like to leave him? So she thought about it. And Jeannie said, what would be the best thing for you? And she thought about it a little more, and she said, to forgive him. Jeannie said, what would that look like? Forgiving him would mean that I would hope that he would change, that I would believe in him, that I would let go of all that pain and anger. She said, then what would you do? I would leave him the money, because if I don't, it would be like a slap after I die. He would find out I'd left it to someone else and know that I didn't believe in him. And even if it's foolish, if I leave him the money, it's my way of saying, I believe in you. And she did. She wrote her will out within just a few minutes, and it was a tremendous relief to her to let go, to love, and to give in that last